Welcome back to the Contend podcast. I'm excited about our episode for today because we're talking about someone who was looking for and contending for the promises that God had given him. The promises of God are wonderful things. So we're going to look at the character of Caleb in our next episode of the Contenders Through History series of this episode of the Contend podcast. As I said just a moment ago in the intro, we're going to be looking at Caleb today. And Caleb is someone who I've always admired his courage and his stand for the Lord, and how he contended and looked towards the promises of God as his motivation for contending, and how great that is for us even at this time. And we see at the end of Numbers chapter 13 and verse number 30, this is after the 12 spies have just got back from spying out the land of Canaan. We know the song, 10 were bad and 2 were good. But we see Caleb, one of the good spies. It says, "And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it.'" And we know that there were giants there, and there was so much that the 10 spies were looking at as a reason to not possess the land. But we see Caleb here looking at the promises of God and saying, hey, God has promised us this land. God has promised us that we'd be able to go in and overcome the Canaanites and see the things come to pass as he promised that we could. And so we see him looking towards those promises and encouraging the people to come with me. Let's go take this land because God promised that we could take it. But not only here in this passage, but also at the end of Caleb's life, once they've crossed over Jordan, after their 40 years of wandering, we know Joshua, the other good spy, becomes the leader of Israel, replaces Moses, and they cross over Jordan and they possess that land. We see that there had been an inheritance that had been promised to Caleb. And so after all this time, he's been looking, he stood up for the promises of God in spying out Canaan, and then he went forward and he conquered Canaan with Joshua as the new leader. And we see him, we get the song, "I Want That Mountain," from Caleb here, looking forward to this promise of being able to possess this certain piece of land that the Lord had promised him. And after all of these years, still contending with the motivation from the promises of God. And how wonderful that is for us to be contenders based on what God has promised us. God has given us many promises. There's a promise book from God's. It has over 1,000 promises, it says on the cover of it, and there's 1,000 promises from God's word in there, and so many promises that apply specifically to us. In 2021, as we go through, there's so many promises that we find in God's word that we can be motivated to contend for the faith because God has promised us whatever it may be. And so we know that God is with us, and we know that God's word won't return void, and that God's going to build his church. And we know all of these things because he's promised them to us. And so what a wonderful example Caleb set for us, contending for the promise of, hey, we'll be able to take over Canaan. And even though the people didn't take his advice and heed what he had to say, we see that he still was looking towards the promises of God at that point. And then at the end of his life, when he was given an inheritance, he was still wanting to go take possession of that land as his looking towards that promise that God had given him already in his life. So let me encourage you today to be someone who looks at the promises that you can find in God's word and say, hey, I can contend, I can go forward because God has promised me so many things, that he'll never leave me, that he's going to go with me, and that he's going to give me strength and hope and peace. And all of these things we can see as we contend for the faith. I hope you'll stick around for just a moment. We're going to look at the song "Standing on the Promises" to go along with our lesson here in the Contend wrap-up. "Standing on the Promises" has always been one of my favorite songs. It was written by Russell Kelso Carter, also known as R. Kelso Carter. He was a star in the athlete at the military academy, and he ended up being a teacher and a coach at the military academy, and then became a ordained Methodist minister for a couple years, and then went on to go to medical school following that. So he was definitely a student at heart. But when he was 30 years old, he had a terrible incident and it affected his heart. And the doctors told him there was really nothing he could do about it. And it was at that point when, although he had professed Christianity, it was that point that he fully surrendered his heart and thus his will to the cause of Christ. In 1886 was the first songbook, the first time we ever saw the song "Standing on the Promises" in a hymnal, and it was in the song, the book "Songs of Perfect Love," which was edited by Carter and John Sweeney. And we see this wonderful song, "Standing on the Promises," after Carter's healing from his condition. He lived another 49 healthy years, and he's quoted as saying that's when the promises of God truly became real unto him. He lived each day resting on the promises of God, as we read of and sing of in the wonderful song "Standing on the Promises." So that's one of my favorite songs, as I said, and what a wonderful thing to stand on the promises of God. Look at those promises that we see in his word, as we saw in the life of Caleb, and use that to help us contend for the faith. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Contend podcast. Just a quick announcement. Our daughter is going to be born. My wife and I's daughter is to be born in the next couple weeks. So I'm going to take a few weeks off from the Contend podcast, but I should be back the end of March, and I'll keep you guys posted through that. If you follow me on social media, I'm sure you'll be seeing some pictures there, but be sure to follow me on social media. Follow Contend there on Facebook and Instagram, and follow us at samgeckler.com too. Be able to keep up with everything going on Contend, and so when we come back, you'll be the first to know. So we'll see you when we come back, and remember, don't be a pretender, be a contender.